When the Civil War began in 1861, North Carolina had a population of about 1 million people. Of those, approximately one-third were slaves. As southern states began to separate from the federal government, loyalties in North Carolina were as divided as those in the nation as a whole. Support for secession was strongest in the eastern part of the state, which had a larger proportion of slaves and wealthy slave owners than the central and western regions of the state. A reluctant North Carolina voted to secede from the Union on May 20, 1861, after the firing at Fort Sumter and a call for volunteers by President Abraham Lincoln. The neighboring states, South Carolina and Virginia, had already voted to leave the Union.
If you don't count the vote to make the Tennessee ordinance of secession legal, North Carolina is the last state to leave the Union and join the Confederacy. But if you're technical and says it can't take effect legally until the people vote, that makes Tennessee the last. North Carolina, and there's a lot of truth to it. There's the saying that North Carolina is that valley of humility between two mountains of conceit.
North Carolina's vote came after Governor John Ellis informed President Lincoln that
I can be no party to this wicked violation of the laws of the country and to this war upon the liberties of free people. You can get no troops from North Carolina.
Ellis, a Democrat, died in July 1861, and the remainder of his term was served by Henry Toole Clark, Speaker of the North Carolina Senate. Zebulon Vance, who had served as commander of the 26th North Carolina Regiment, was then elected governor and served from September 1862 until the end of the war. To achieve its objectives, the North would have to conquer the South, whereas the South had only to convince the North to recognize its independence. By 1865, the war had been raging for nearly 4 years at the cost of hundreds of thousands of lives. The conflict had lasted much longer than most had expected. After devastating defeats at Gettysburg and Vicksburg in mid-1863, the sun had begun to set on Southern hopes for independence. In 1864, Lincoln finally found the generals who would be more than a match for Lee and the Confederate armies. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant was appointed Commander-in-Chief of all armies of the United States on March 10, 1864, and Major General William Tecumseh Sherman assumed command of the Military Division of the Mississippi on March 18. In May 1864, Grant and Sherman launched their army groups against Lee in Virginia and Joseph E. Johnston in Georgia. The spring, summer, and fall of 1864 witnessed intense, continuous combat with massive casualties on both sides in Virginia. As the election of 1864 approached, Lee and Grant remained deadlocked in Virginia, and Johnston and the Army of Tennessee still held the gates to Atlanta against Sherman. Northerners were very discouraged. Lincoln thought he would lose the election. To the west, Federal forces under Sherman finally captured the critical southern city of Atlanta in September 1864, raising Northern morale and helping Lincoln win re-election. In November 1864, Sherman cut his supply lines and began his march to the sea, unleashing hard war on Georgia. He was able to present the city of Savannah to President Lincoln as a Christmas present. Sherman then took aim at the Carolinas.